February 17, 1937, 10 o'clock in the morning. High above the churning, frigid turquoise of the San Francisco Bay, 13 men were standing on a 10-ton wooden staging area, suspended like a cradle beneath the floor of the bridge. They were stripping away the wooden forms used to pour the concrete roadway. It was routine work, a Tuesday morning like any other, until the sound of a gunshot echoed across the water. But it wasn't a gun. It was the sound of a massive steel bolt snapping under the weight of 10 tons of timber and human bone. Then came another crack, and another rapid fire as the entire staging unit tore away from its moorings. 13 men began to fall. Below them was the safety net, the legendary $160,000 insurance policy that was supposed to make this the first major construction project in history with a zero-death toll. But 10 tons of wood and steel don't just land, they accelerate. The net, designed to catch a falling man, was never meant to catch a collapsing building. It groaned once, the hemp fibers screaming, and then it tore open like wet paper. 10 men plummeted 250 feet into the Pacific. One of them was Fred Dumatson, only 24 years old, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, now tumbling through the fog. Beside him was Chris Anderson, a veteran of the high steel who had spent years defying gravity. They hit the water at 75 miles per hour. At that speed, the surface of the ocean isn't liquid, it's concrete. This was the day the dream of the Golden Gate Bridge broke. 10 men died in a single instant, their bodies swallowed by the same currents that engineers said would make this bridge impossible to build. How many lives is a beautiful view worth? And why were these men told they were safe when the engineers knew they were working in a death trap? This is the story of the Golden Gate Bridge, a monument to human ambition and an altar of human sacrifice. We see it today as an icon, a shimmering Art Deco masterpiece in international orange, but every inch of that steel was paid for in blood. Long before the first rivet was driven, the Golden Gate was considered a graveyard. The strait itself is a geographical nightmare. It is a narrow gap where the massive power of the Pacific Ocean meets the drainage of the entire Central Valley of California. The tides roar through that gap at 9 knots, creating whirlpools that can suck a small boat under in seconds. The fog is so thick it can blind a pilot in midday, and the winds howl through the canyon of the gate with the force of a hurricane. In the early 1920s, experts said a bridge couldn't be built there. They said the foundations would be swept away, that the wind would twist the steel like a ribbon, and that the cost would bankrupt the city. But San Francisco was a city under siege by its own success. By 1923, the city was booming, but it was trapped. To the west was the ocean, to the east the bay, and to the north, the only way out was by ferry. The Southern Pacific Railroad held a crushing monopoly on the ferry lines. If you wanted to get to Marin County, you waited in line for hours. You paid their prices. You moved at their speed. The city was suffocating, and the businessmen of San Francisco knew that if they couldn't break the ferry monopoly, the city would wither. They needed a bridge. They needed a miracle. And into that desperation stepped a man named Joseph Strauss. Strauss was a 5-foot-tall engineer with a 5-story ego. He was a man who saw himself as a poet of steel, a visionary who could conquer nature itself. He had built hundreds of bridges, mostly small drawbridges, but he had never attempted anything on the scale of the Golden Gate. When he first proposed his design in 1921, it wasn't the elegant suspension bridge we see today. It was a hideous, clunky hybrid, a massive cantilever structure that looked like 2 giant upside-down brackets reaching out to shake hands. It was described as a glass-enclosed birdcage, and an ugly intrusion on the natural beauty of the gate. But Strauss didn't care about beauty, he cared about the contract. He spent a decade lobbying, politicking, and fighting the ferry companies in court. He sold the bridge as an economic necessity, a way to create thousands of jobs in a country that was rapidly sliding into the Great Depression. By the time the project was finally approved, the design had changed. Other engineers, men like Leon Moisseiff and Charles Alton Ellis, had convinced Strauss that a suspension bridge was the only way to span the 6,700 feet of the strait. Irving Morrow, an architect, added the Art Deco flourishes and the bold orange color. But while the architects were arguing over the shade of paint, the workers were looking at the reality of the job. They were being asked to climb hundreds of feet into the air, over a freezing ocean, in winds that could blow a man off a girder before he even knew he was falling. The promise made to these men was simple: you will be safe. Strauss, obsessed with his reputation, made safety a central pillar of the project's marketing. He mandated that every worker wear a hard hat, a revolutionary idea at the time, developed by the Bullard Company in San Francisco. He insisted on safety goggles and respirators for the men working in the lead-painted steel, and most importantly, he installed the net. It was a massive safety net of manila rope, stretched from pylon to pylon under the entire length of the floor. It cost $160,000, an astronomical sum in 1936, but Strauss used it as a shield against criticism. He told the press, he told the city, and he told the workers that the net would catch anyone who slipped. The men who did fall and survived became members of an exclusive, grim society, the Halfway to Hell Club. There were 19 of them. They were the lucky ones. They would stumble out of the net, shaken and bruised, but alive. The net gave the workers a sense of bravado. It made them feel invincible. They took pride in it. They called it their circus net. But that pride was built on a foundation of lies. The net was designed to catch an individual human being weighing 200 pounds, not a 10-ton failure of engineering. Behind the scenes, the project was a pressure cooker. The Great Depression was at its peak. Outside the construction gates, thousands of men stood in bread lines, desperate for any kind of work. The men on the bridge knew that if they complained about safety, if they moved too slowly, or if they hesitated on the high steel, there were 10 men waiting to take their boots. This desperation was the unspoken fuel of the Golden Gate Bridge. The contractors knew they could push the men harder and faster because the labor market was a buyer's market. They paid $5 a day for the most dangerous work on earth, and the men took it with a smile because it meant their children wouldn't starve. The engineering challenges were unprecedented. To build the South Tower, they had to construct a pier 1,100 feet out into the open ocean. They had to build a giant fender, a concrete wall the size of a football stadium, to protect the tower from wandering ships in the fog. Divers had to descend 100 feet into the dark, churning water, where the tides could pin them against the rocks and drown them in an instant. They worked in short shifts, battling the bends and the bone-chilling cold, often guided only by touch in the murky depths. This wasn't just construction, it was combat. And the first casualty of that combat didn't happen in the air. It happened in the foundations. Kermit Moore was a worker on the bridge, a man with a family, a man who believed in the promise of the project. On a cold day in October 1936, he was working on the bridge's floor when a piece of heavy equipment shifted. It wasn't a spectacular fall. It wasn't a headline-grabbing disaster. It was just a heavy derrick that toppled, crushing him instantly. He was the first. The bridge had claimed its first life, and the zero-death dream was officially dead. But the project didn't stop. The machines didn't go silent. Strauss and the bridge district didn't hold a day of mourning. They moved the equipment, cleaned up the blood, and hired a replacement. The public was told that Moore's death was a fluke, a one-in-a-million accident. They were reminded of the net. They were reminded of the hard hats. They were told that the Golden Gate was still the safest construction site in the world. This was the lie that kept the rivets flying. The workers were told that as long as they followed the rules, the bridge would protect them. But the rules were written by men in offices who didn't have to feel the wind vibrating the cables at 400 feet. The rules were written by men who weren't standing on a staging unit held together by bolts that hadn't been properly inspected for the stress of the load they were carrying. As the two towers rose into the San Francisco fog, they were hailed as a triumph of the human spirit. They were the tallest and most beautiful structures in the world. But for the men climbing them, they were something else. They were a landscape of terror. Every morning, the workers would ride the skip up the side of the tower, feeling the temperature drop and the wind pick up. They would step out onto steel beams that were only a few inches wide, with nothing but the Pacific Ocean beneath them. They worked through the San Francisco summer, which meant freezing fog that made the steel as slippery as ice. They worked through the winter storms that swayed the tower's feet in either direction. And through it all, Joseph Strauss was there, or at least his image was. He was the face of the bridge, the man who would take the credit for every ton of steel and every gallon of paint. He was the man who would stand on the podium and talk about the conquest of the gate. But he wasn't the one who felt the snap of the cables on February 17th. He wasn't the one who heard the scream of Fred Dumatson as he realized the net wasn't going to hold. When that staging unit fell, it didn't just kill 10 men. It exposed the rot beneath the Art Deco glamour. It showed that all the safety nets and hard hats in the world couldn't protect a worker from a systemic failure of engineering and oversight. The staging had been moved several times, the bolts stressed and restressed, with no one accounting for the fatigue of the metal. The men were working on a platform that was essentially a ticking time bomb. The sound of the collapse was heard all the way back at the toll plaza. Men ran to the edge, looking down into the hole in the net where their friends had just been. They saw the debris floating in the water-shattered timber, twisted rope, and the bodies of men who had been laughing and drinking coffee just minutes before. The rescue boats scrambled, but the Golden Gate doesn't give up its victims easily. The currents were already carrying the wreckage out toward the open sea. We are told that the Golden Gate Bridge was a miracle of the Great Depression, a sign that America could still build great things even in its darkest hour. We are told it is a symbol of hope. But for the families of the 11 men who died, it is a headstone. They were sold a vision of a safe, modern workplace, a project that would value their lives as much as the steel they were joining. That vision was a lie. The bridge was built the same way every great American project was built, by trading the lives of the desperate for the glory of the powerful. As we look back at the beginning of this project, we see the ambition of Strauss, the greed of the city boosters, and the desperation of the workmen. We see the birth of an icon, but if you look closer beneath the international orange, you can see the cracks in the promise. You can see the moment the staging snapped. You can hear the gunshot of the steel bolt. The bridge was rising, the towers were touching the clouds, and the city was cheering. But the cost was being tallied in a morgue on the docks. The bodies were already piling up, and the bridge wasn't even finished yet. The Great Depression had turned the American dream into a breadline, and for the men standing on the fog-choked docks of San Francisco in 1933, the rising towers of the Golden Gate Bridge weren't just an engineering marvel. They were a life raft. If you were a man with a strong back and a steady hand, you didn't look at the heights with fear. You looked at them with hunger. They called themselves Skywalkers. They were a rough collection of Scandinavian sailors who knew how to balance on a moving mast in a gale, and Irish immigrants who had spent generations digging the foundations of a country that didn't always want them. To the world, they were heroes of progress. To the Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District, they were replaceable parts in a machine that ran on sweat and blood. For the wage of $11 a day, these men agreed to dance on steel beams 4 inches wide, hundreds of feet above a churning graveyard of riptides and white-capped waves. $11 was a fortune when your children were starving, but the bridge was a greedy landlord, and it was preparing to collect a rent that no man should have to pay. Before the first piece of steel ever touched the sky, the bridge began its assault on the human body beneath the waves. The construction of the South Pier was a descent into a liquid hell. To anchor the bridge against the violent currents of the Golden Gate, workers had to blast a trench into the bedrock over 100 feet below the surface. This was the era of the heavy-gear divers, men encased in copper helmets and canvas suits, weighted down by lead boots that made them move like ghosts in the dark. They worked in a world of absolute freezing blackness, where the tide moved with such force that it could pin a man against the steel forms and crush his ribs before he could signal the surface. These divers faced the squeezes, a terrifying phenomenon where a failure in the air pressure would cause the suit to collapse inward, literally crushing the diver's soft tissues into the helmet. Even if they survived the pressure, the decompression was a slow torture. Many of these men emerged from the depths with permanent lung damage or the bends, their joints screaming as nitrogen bubbles expanded in their blood. They were the foundation of the bridge, buried in the mud and the dark, their health sacrificed to ensure the towers stood straight. But the danger wasn't only in the water, it was in the very air the workers breathed. As the steel rose, the bridge took on its iconic international orange hue. To the tourists on the shore, it was a masterpiece. To the painters and riveters, it was a slow-acting poison. The steel arrived from the mills coated in red lead primer, a toxic concoction designed to prevent rust in the salty Pacific air. To join the beams, workers had to heat rivets until they were white-hot and hammer them into place, a process that sent clouds of lead-laced dust into their lungs. The worst of it happened inside the cells of the tower's cramped, unventilated steel boxes where men spent 10 hours a day hosing down rivets and painting. Inside those boxes, the heat and the fumes were a suffocating fog. Men began to suffer from the lead shakes, a neurological breakdown that caused tremors, hallucinations, and agonizing stomach cramps. The contractors knew the lead was toxic, but ventilation was expensive and time was money. They let the men breathe the poison, knowing that for every worker who collapsed from lead poisoning, there were 100 more on the docks waiting to take his place. For 3 years, the bridge had a reputation for being a charmed project. Joseph Strauss, the chief engineer, boasted of his safety record. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a massive safety net, a revolutionary idea at the time, stretched beneath the floor of the bridge to catch anyone who fell. He mandated the use of hard hats, developed by the Bullard Company, and safety belts for the Skywalkers. But let be clear, Strauss didn't do this out of the goodness of his heart. He did it because the insurance premiums for a project of this scale were astronomical. Every death on the site raised the cost of the project, and Strauss was a man obsessed with his budget. The safety gear was an investment in the bottom line, not a testament to the value of human life. And on October 21, 1936, the charm finally broke. Kermit Moore was 31 years old, a man with a family and a future that ended in a heartbeat. He was working on the bridge deck when a traveling derrick, a massive crane used to move steel, suddenly buckled. The heavy machinery didn't just fall, it screamed as the steel twisted and snapped. Moore had no time to run. Derrick crushed him against the bridge structure, killing him instantly in a spray of blood and shattered bone. He was the first worker to die on the Golden Gate Bridge. The news hit the city like a physical blow, but the reaction from the bridge authorities was chillingly clinical. The media, coached by the project's publicists, largely dismissed Moore's death as a statistical inevitability. They argued that on a project of this magnitude, one death every $1 million spent was the industry standard. Since the bridge cost $35 million, they expected 35 men to die. By their logic, Kermit Moore was just a decimal point. They didn't see a father or a husband. They saw an acceptable loss. But the statistics were about to get much darker. The morning of February 17, 1937, began with a heavy mist rolling in from the Pacific. A crew of 13 men was working on a 5-ton removal platform, a massive wooden scaffold suspended beneath the bridge deck. They were stripping away the temporary floor to make way for the final roadway. Among them were men like O.A. Anderson, a veteran of the high steel, and Terence Hallinan, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. They were seasoned, careful, and they trusted the equipment. But as the platform moved, a heavy cast-iron bolt, stressed beyond its limit, suddenly sheared off. The sound was like a gunshot. In an instant, the 5-ton platform tilted. The weight was too much for the remaining supports, and they snapped one by one in a rapid-fire succession of steel screaming against steel. The platform, with 13 men clinging to it, plunged toward the safety net. For a second, it seemed the net would do its job. It caught the platform, sagging under the immense weight. But then the unthinkable happened. The heavy wooden beams of the platform had sharp, jagged edges from the fall, and as the net stretched, the wood acted like a knife. The safety net, the pride of Joseph Strauss, ripped open. The men fell. They didn't just fall into the water. They fell into a tangled web of steel mesh and heavy timber that dragged them down like an anchor. They fell 220 feet. At that height, hitting the water is like hitting concrete at 75 miles per hour. The impact alone was enough to shatter every bone in their bodies, but for those who survived the initial hit, the horror was only beginning. The heavy net and the wooden platform landed on top of them, pinning them beneath the freezing surface of the Golden Gate. The names of the dead on that day should be etched into the memory of every person who crosses that span. There was O.A. Anderson, who left behind a family that would never see him again. There was William Bass and Oral Desper, men who had survived the worst of the Depression only to be claimed by the bridge. Fred Dumatson, Eldridge Hillen, and Charles Lindros were dragged into the depths, their lungs filling with salt water as they struggled against the heavy mesh. Jack Norman, Louis Russell, and Chris Schmidt were lost to the tide. Terence Hallinan, just a young man trying to earn a living, vanished into the gray water. Only 2 men survived the plunge. One was Slim Lambert, who managed to kick his way out of the tangled net and swim to the surface, his body broken but his will intact. He would later describe the sensation of the fall as a lifetime compressed into seconds, the wind whistling past his ears before the world turned into a crushing wall of water. The other men weren't so lucky. The recovery effort was a grim spectacle. Divers went down into the riptides to retrieve what was left of the crew. They found bodies mangled by the impact and the weight of the debris. The 10 who fell became a somber legend in San Francisco, a reminder that the bridge was built on a foundation of corpses. The aftermath of the February disaster was a masterclass in corporate damage control. Work was halted, not out of respect for the dead, but because the safety net, the project's primary insurance shield, was gone. Strauss and the contractors scrambled to deflect blame. They pointed to the act of God clause in their contracts, arguing that no one could have predicted the bolt failure. They fought the families of the deceased over every cent of compensation, dragging mourning widows through grueling legal battles to avoid paying out the full value of the men's lives. The bridge district wanted the public to focus on the majesty of the span, not the blood on the girders. They quickly replaced the net, restarted the engines, and the Skywalkers went back to work. The empty lockers in the bunkhouses were filled by new men within 48 hours. As the final sections of the roadway were laid, the toll of the bridge extended beyond the spectacular deaths. There were the men who survived but were left as shells of their former selves, men whose hands never stopped shaking from the lead, men whose hearing was permanently destroyed by the constant, deafening thunder of the rivet guns. Woke up screaming in the middle of the night, still feeling the sensation of the catwalk swaying in a 60-mile-per-hour gale. These were the walking wounded of the Golden Gate, the invisible casualties of progress who received no medals and no mentions in the history books. The bridge was nearing completion, its towers standing as monuments to human ingenuity and the triumph over nature. But for the families of Kermit Moore and the 10 men who fell in February, the Golden Gate wasn't a triumph. It was a tombstone. The city began planning a week-long celebration, a fiesta that would draw hundreds of thousands of people to walk across the orange span. There would be parades, speeches by politicians who had never set foot on a high beam, and fireworks that would light up the sky. But in the shadows of the towers, the true cost was being tallied in ways that numbers could never capture. The death toll kept climbing, but the project didn't slow the transition from the solid ground of the Marin Headlands to the churning, unpredictable graveyard of the Golden Gate Strait was not just a feat of construction. It was a descent into a mechanical fever dream where the laws of nature seemed determined to tear the blueprints from the hands of the men who dared to draw them. We often talk about the bridge as a triumph of the human spirit, but that is a sanitized version of the truth. In reality, it was a brutal war of attrition between a man's ego and the unforgiving physics of the Pacific Ocean. While the workers were being crushed by falling steel and battered by the elements, a different kind of violence was taking place in the drafting rooms. This was the war of the mind, and its first casualty was the man who actually designed the bridge you see today. His name was Charles Ellis. If you look at the commemorative plaques or the official histories written by the Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District, you will find the name Joseph Strauss in bold letters. Strauss was the showman, the politician, and the man who claimed the glory. But Strauss was not a structural engineer. He was a builder of modest bascule bridges, the kind that flip up to let tugboats pass in quiet harbors. He had no idea how to span the Golden Gate. Charles Ellis was the forgotten genius, a professor and a mathematician who took Strauss' ugly, heavy initial design and transformed it into the soaring, graceful suspension bridge that defines the San Francisco skyline. For months, Ellis worked 24 hours a day, performing thousands of complex calculations by hand. He was obsessed with the math of stress points, wind resistance, and the terrifying reality of how much weight a single wire could hold. He was the one who realized that the bridge didn't just need to be strong, it needed to be flexible enough to breathe with the wind. But Joseph Strauss didn't want a genius. He wanted a subordinate who met deadlines. When Ellis requested more time to double-check his stress calculations, fearing that a mistake in the math would mean a collapse that would kill hundreds, Strauss saw it as an act of defiance. In December of 1931, Strauss sent Ellis a letter telling him to take a vacation. While Ellis was away, Strauss sent another letter, "Don't come back." He fired the man who had done all the heavy lifting, then spent the next several years scrubbing Ellis' name from the official record. Strauss took the credit, and the bridge was built using Ellis' plans, but without Ellis there to oversee the implementation of his own life's work. It was an act of professional theft that nearly compromised the structural integrity of the entire project, as Strauss prioritized his ego over the one man who understood the bridge's soul. While the engineers fought in the offices, the men on the water were fighting for their lives against the sea itself. The South Pier was the project's greatest nightmare. Unlike the North Pier, which sat on solid ground, the South Pier had to be built 1,100 feet out into the open water of the strait. The divers were sent down into a world of absolute darkness. 110 feet below the surface, the water was a churning mess of silt and pulverized rock. There was zero visibility. These men were encased in heavy brass helmets and canvas suits, tethered to the surface by a single air hose that could be severed by a piece of drifting debris at any second. They worked in 20-minute shifts, the maximum time allowed before the crushing pressure would cause their blood to fizz with nitrogen. They were tasked with blasting the bedrock using dynamite, essentially navigating an underwater minefield by touch. Every time the tide turned, the water surged through the Golden Gate at nearly 10 knots, threatening to rip the divers away from their tethers and sweep them into the abyss of the Pacific. To get the materials out to the South Pier site, The contractors built a massive access trestle, a temporary bridge made of wood and steel. In August of 1934, the fog that thick, blinding San Francisco wall became a weapon of the sea. A massive cargo ship, the Sidney M. Hauptmann, emerged from the gray mist like a ghost. It wasn't moving fast, but it had the momentum of thousands of tons of steel behind it. The ship plowed directly into the South Pier trestle, snapping the heavy pilings like they were toothpicks and sending 600 feet of the structure into the water. The workers on the trestle scrambled for their lives as the ground beneath them vanished. It was a miracle no one died that day, but the sea wasn't finished. Over the next several months, massive storms battered the coast. The trestle was rebuilt only to be smashed again by the waves. Then it was rebuilt a second time and smashed again. 3 times the Pacific Ocean reclaimed the work of the men, mocking their progress. The cost of these delays was measured in millions of dollars, and the pressure from the bondholders began to mount. The message from the top was clear. The project must stay on schedule, no matter how many risks the men had to take. By 1936, the towers were complete, rising 746 feet above the water. Now came the most terrifying phase of the project, spinning the cables. These cables are the muscles of the bridge, 3 feet in diameter, each composed of 27,572 individual wires. To install them, the workers had to traverse catwalks that were only 3 feet wide, suspended hundreds of feet in the air. Imagine standing on a piece of wire mesh the width of a sidewalk, 700 feet above a churning ocean, with nothing but a single hand wire for safety. The wind at that height was constant, a howling gale that could gust to 60 miles per hour without warning. The catwalks would buck and sway like a ship in a storm. The men were forbidden from wearing safety harnesses because the management believed that a harness would make them too slow and too comfortable. Instead, they had to rely on their own balance and a desperate grip on the handrail. The spinning wheels moved back and forth across the span, carrying the wire from one side to the other. These wheels moved at 600 feet per minute, a blur of heavy steel that could knock a man off his feet in a heartbeat. If a wire snapped under tension, it became a whip that could decapitate a man or sever a limb instantly. The men worked in this high-altitude purgatory for months, their fingers numb from the cold, their ears ringing from the wind, knowing that a single slip meant a 7-second fall into the cold embrace of the bay. Joseph Strauss, sensing the growing public outcry over the danger, finally authorized the installation of a massive safety net. It cost $130,000, a staggering sum in the 1930s, and was made of heavy manila rope. It stretched from pylon to pylon, underneath the entire length of the floor beams. For a while, it was hailed as a miracle of modern safety. 19 men fell into that net and lived to tell the story. They called themselves the Halfway to Hell Club. They would buy each other drinks and toast to their luck, believing that the net was an unbreakable shield. But the net wasn't a shield, it was a false promise. It was designed to catch a falling man, not a falling piece of the bridge. On February 17, 1937, the engineering flaws and the pressure for speed finally converged in a moment of absolute horror. A 10-ton staging scaffold, a massive platform used by the paving crews, was being moved. It was held in place by heavy aluminum bolts that were supposed to be the pinnacle of safety. But the bolts weren't strong enough to handle the lateral stress as the scaffold was shifted. The bolts sheared off with a sound like a gunshot. The 5-ton scaffold tilted, then tore free from its moorings. As it fell, it didn't just drop through the air, it acted like a giant guillotine. It struck the safety net with such force that the $130,000 manila rope system didn't just stretch, it disintegrated. Eyewitnesses described the net tearing like wet tissue paper. There were 13 men on that scaffold. They didn't fall into the net, they fell with the net. The heavy rope, the steel beams, and the screaming men all plunged 220 feet into the water. The impact was so violent that the men were likely dead before they even hit the surface, crushed by the very equipment that was supposed to keep them safe. 10 men died in that single instant. The net, the great symbol of Strauss's humanity, lay in a tangled, useless heap at the bottom of the bay, a monument to the fact that you cannot engineer safety when you are cutting corners on the materials and the math. The recovery effort was a grim reflection of the project's priorities. Divers were sent down to pull the bodies from the twisted wreckage of the net, but the currents were so strong that several of the men were never found. They remain there today, part of the bridge's foundation, their names largely forgotten by the millions of tourists who snap photos of the International Orange Towers. As the project neared its final months, The atmosphere on the site shifted from one of ambition to one of mourning. The Halfway to Hell Club no longer felt like an elite fraternity. It felt like a group of men waiting for their number to be called. The engineering challenges had been met, the cables were spun, and the road was paved, but the cost had moved beyond the realm of dollars and cents. The bridge was a masterpiece of steel and math, but it was also a cemetery. The math war between Strauss and Ellis had left the project's intellectual foundation fractured. The battle with the sea had proven that nature could only be held back for so long. And the failure of the net had exposed the terrifying truth that in the eyes of the men in charge, a worker was just another replaceable component, no different from a rivet or a bolt. The bridge was almost finished. The politicians were already drafting their speeches about the triumph of civilization and the unconquerable spirit of California. They were preparing to cut the ribbons and celebrate the dawn of a new era of connectivity. For the families of the men who had been swallowed by the fog, crushed by the scaffold, or erased from the blueprints, there was no triumph. There was only the cold, hard reality of the steel that stood as a headstone for the lives traded for a faster commute. As completion neared, the true cost was becoming clear. Next time you cross the Golden Gate Bridge, remember the workers who paid with their lives. If you want to know the cost of progress, hit subscribe. I'll show you what they built and who they buried. When you look at the Golden Gate Bridge today, you see a triumph of human will. You see the international orange glow against the Pacific fog, a symbol of American ingenuity that supposedly conquered the impossible. But the history books you read in school are a curated set of lies, written by the victors and the profiteers. They tell you about the 11 who fell, as if the cost of this bridge can be neatly contained in a single-digit statistic. They tell you Joseph Strauss was the lone visionary who willed the steel into existence. But if you dig beneath the concrete anchors and look into the archives that the Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District tried to bury, you find a story of professional assassination, corporate greed, and the systematic erasure of the people who were here long before the first rivet was driven. The first victim of the Golden Gate Bridge wasn't killed by a falling beam or a snapped cable. He was murdered professionally. His name was Charles Alton Ellis. If you've never heard of him, that's exactly what Joseph Strauss intended. Strauss was a promoter, a man who loved the spotlight but lacked the mathematical genius to actually design a suspension bridge of this magnitude. Charles Ellis was the professor, the quiet intellectual who spent years hunched over a desk, performing thousands of complex calculations by hand to ensure the towers wouldn't buckle under the weight of the Pacific gales. For 3 years, Ellis lived and breathed the bridge. He designed the suspension system, the towers, and the floor. But Strauss grew jealous of the attention Ellis was receiving from the engineering community. In November 1931, with the project finally ready to break ground, Strauss ordered Ellis to take a vacation. While Ellis was away, Strauss sent him a letter telling him not to come back. Strauss didn't just fire him, he erased him. He ordered Ellis' name scrubbed from every blueprint, every press release, and every official record of the project. For 70 years, the man who actually built the Golden Gate Bridge in his mind was treated as a ghost. Ellis died in 1949, penniless and forgotten, watching from afar as Strauss took all the credit for the mathematics he had perfected. It wasn't until 2007 that the district finally admitted the truth, quietly adding his name to a plaque. But the damage was done. The bridge was built on a foundation of stolen credit, a harbinger of the many erasures that would follow. While Strauss was busy killing a man's legacy, the bridge was busy killing the men on the line. We are told that only 11 men died, but that number is a convenient fiction designed to protect insurance premiums and public perception. The official 11 only counts the men who died in sudden, violent accidents on the job site. It ignores the silent, slow-motion massacres that took place in the lungs and bloodstreams of the workforce. Think about the painters. To protect the steel from the corrosive salt air, the bridge was coated in a lead-based primer known as red lead. Men spent 10-hour shifts in cramped, unventilated spaces, inhaling microscopic shards of lead dust and toxic fumes. They didn't fall to their deaths. They went home to their families with their gums turning blue, their joints aching, and their brains swelling. By the time the bridge opened, dozens of these men were suffering from chronic lead poisoning. They died years later in hospital beds, coughing up blood, their deaths never attributed to the bridge, their families never seeing a dime of compensation. Then there were the divers. To build the South Pier, men had to descend 100 feet into the dark, churning waters of the Golden Gate. They worked in heavy brass helmets, battling some of the strongest currents on the planet. When they came up too fast, The nitrogen in their blood turned into bubbles, a condition known as the bends. It felt like their bones were being crushed from the inside out. Many of these divers ended up permanently paralyzed or suffering from neurological damage that left them unable to work. But because they didn't die in the water, they didn't make the official list. The bridge didn't just take lives, it took the ability to live. The reason these men weren't protected wasn't a lack of technology, it was a lack of will. The money trail leads directly to the doors of the Bank of America. During the Great Depression, while the rest of the country was starving, Amedeo Giannini and his bank saw the Golden Gate Bridge not as a public service, but as a guaranteed return on investment. The bridge was funded by a $35 million bond issue, and the Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District prioritized the repayment of those bonds and their mounting interest over the lives of the workers. Every dollar spent on a safety upgrade or a better ventilation system for the painters was a dollar that couldn't go back into the pockets of the bondholders. The district fought tooth and nail against every safety regulation that threatened the bottom line. It took a near revolt from the workers and the horrific tragedy of 1937 for them to finally invest in the safety net that Strauss would later claim was his own brilliant idea. But the bridge didn't just kill workers, it killed history. Before the first anchor was poured, the land belonged to the Ohlone people. For thousands of years, the Muwekma Ohlone lived along these shores, leaving behind massive shell mounds that served as both village sites and sacred burial grounds. To the engineers, these weren't ancestral monuments, they were obstacles. At the Presidio and across the water in Sausalito, steam shovels tore through the shell mounds, grinding the bones of Ohlone ancestors into the dirt to make way for the bridge's massive concrete footings. No archaeologists were called. No ceremonies were held. Thousands of years of indigenous history were literally paved over, buried under millions of tons of steel and asphalt. The bridge is anchored in the desecrated graves of a civilization the builders chose to ignore. The environmental cost was just as staggering. To make room for the approach roads, the developers razed the ancient forests of the Presidio, cutting down thousands of trees that had stood for centuries. They blasted through hillsides and redirected natural waterways, forever altering the ecosystem of the peninsula. But the true displacement was social. The Golden Gate Bridge was the primary engine for what we now call white flight. It was designed to allow the wealthy and the middle class to escape the perceived congestion of San Francisco for the manicured suburbs of Marin County. As the tax base fled across the bridge, the city's inner neighborhoods were left to rot. This bridge directly facilitated the destruction of the Fillmore district. Known as the Harlem of the West, the Fillmore was a thriving hub of black culture, music, and business. But in the 1950s and 60s, the city used the expansion of the bridge's connecting infrastructure as a pretext for urban renewal. They called it a slum clearance, but in reality, it was a government-sponsored ethnic cleansing. They bulldozed 2,500 Victorian homes. They destroyed 800 businesses. They displaced 20,000 people. The bridge provided the physical path for the wealthy to leave and the political excuse to destroy the communities that stayed behind. The families of the men who actually died building the bridge were left with nothing but shadows. On February 17, 1937, when the scaffold broke and 10 men plunged into the icy water, the city mourned for a day. But the legal battle that followed lasted years. The widows of men like Louis Russell and Chris Anderson were offered pittance settlements that barely covered the cost of a funeral. The Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District, flush with bond money and celebrating the bridge's completion, spent more on the opening day party than they did on the families of the 10 who fell. At the opening ceremony, Strauss stood before a crowd of thousands and recited a poem he wrote called, "At Last, the Mighty Task is Done." He didn't mention Charles Ellis. He didn't mention the Ohlone shell mounds. He didn't mention the painters with lead in their blood or the widows in the Fillmore. The structure opened to celebration. Nobody mentioned the bodies buried in the foundation. Next time you cross the Golden Gate Bridge, remember the men who were erased from the blueprints and the ancestors whose graves were ground into gravel. Remember that every mile of progress has a shadow, and this bridge casts one of the longest in America. The cost of this view wasn't $35 million. It was the soul of the communities it displaced and the lives of the men it chewed up and spat out. If you want to know the cost of progress, hit subscribe. I'll show you what they built and who they buried. May 27, 1937. The San Francisco fog peeled back like a theater curtain to reveal a monument that shouldn't have existed. It was the start of Fiesta Week, a 7-day carnival of civic pride, and 200,000 people swarmed the span on foot. They came to marvel at the impossible. They came to walk across the clouds on a ribbon of steel painted a color called international orange. There were parades, beauty pageants, and speeches that echoed into the salt air. Joseph Strauss, the man who had claimed every ounce of glory for himself, stood before the crowds and declared that this bridge would last forever. But as the thousands of feet thrummed against the roadway, creating a vibration that could be felt in the very bedrock of the Marin headlands, there was a deafening silence where there should have been names. Among the 200,000 revelers, you would have struggled to find a single official mention of Fred Dumatson. You wouldn't have seen a plaque for Elliot Lewis or Slim Lambert's 9 crewmates who were dragged into the depths only months earlier. The families of the fallen were not on the dais. The widows were not given the microphone. For the architects of progress, the 11 men who died were merely a line item in the ledger of a $35 million project. The celebration was a mask, a bright orange veil pulled over the faces of the dead to ensure the public only saw the triumph, never the trauma. The irony of that opening day is a wound that has never truly healed. We are told that the Golden Gate Bridge is a symbol of American ingenuity, but it is actually a monument to the things we are willing to overlook. While the crowds cheered in 1937, the man who actually designed the bridge, Charles Ellis, was sitting in a small room in Illinois, erased from the history books because he dared to prioritize mathematical safety over Joseph Strauss' ego. The bridge opened with a lie at its center, and that lie has sprouted into a dark, modern legacy. Today, when you look at that iconic silhouette against the sunset, you aren't just looking at a transit corridor. You are looking at one of the most prolific suicide destinations on the planet. Since its opening, more than 1,700 people have leaped from these railings. For decades, the Bridge District fought against the installation of a safety net, citing the aesthetic beauty of the structure as a reason to let the body count rise. They argued that a net would ruin the view. It is the same cold, calculated logic that governed the construction site in the 1930s, the idea that the look of the thing is worth more than the lives of the people on it. Only now, nearly 90 years later, is a $400 million steel net finally being completed. It is a staggering sum, a price tag that dwarfs the original cost of the entire bridge, spent simply to catch the people the system has failed. But the rot isn't just metaphorical, it is physical. Golden Gate Bridge is currently fighting a losing battle against the very elements it was built to defy. The Pacific Ocean is not a silent neighbor, it is a chemical assailant. The salt-laden mist that makes the bridge look so ethereal in photographs is actually a corrosive acid that never stops eating. Engineers call it accelerated corrosion. Because the bridge was built on a foundation of rushed timelines and suppressed safety concerns, the maintenance cycle is now an endless, multi-billion-dollar loop. We are spending hundreds of millions of dollars just to keep the steel from dissolving into the bay. And when we look at how we build today, it's clear we haven't learned a single lesson from the 11 men who fell. Look no further than the eastern span of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. It was supposed to be a modern marvel, a $6.4 billion replacement for a structure damaged in the 1989 earthquake. Instead, it became a masterclass in modern corruption. The new Bay Bridge was plagued by what critics called xenocorrosion. To save money, the state of California sourced massive amounts of steel from China, only to discover cracked welds and structural inconsistencies that were covered up by management. When a senior engineer named James McLean blew the whistle on the faulty foundation piles and the thousands of suspect bolts that were snapping under tension, he wasn't rewarded for his honesty. He was marginalized, silenced, and pushed out, mirroring the exact treatment Charles Ellis received nearly a century before. McLean pointed out that the 3-inch thick steel plates were riddled with cracks that could lead to a catastrophic failure during a seismic event. The response from the authorities wasn't to fix the steel, it was to fix the narrative. They spent millions on public relations to convince you that the bridge was safe, while the men on the ground knew the foundation was flawed. This is the hidden cost of the modern era. We have traded the blunt brutality of the 1930s for a more sophisticated, bureaucratic form of negligence. We don't just bury workers in the foundation anymore. We bury their warnings in non-disclosure agreements and redacted reports. The Golden Gate Bridge stands today as a haunting reminder that we are still building on blood. Every time a bolt is replaced, every time a new coat of international orange is applied to hide the rust, we are participating in a cycle of structural neglect. The bridge is a beautiful facade for a system that views human life as a secondary consideration to the movement of capital. We celebrate the Halfway to Hell Club as a triumph of safety, but we forget that the net only existed because the workers threatened to strike. We forget that the 10 men who died on February 17, 1937, fell because a heavy piece of equipment was allowed to crush the very safety device meant to save them. That wasn't an accident. It was a failure of oversight. It was the result of a culture that prioritized the speed of the cranes over the stability of the platforms. As you stand on the Embarcadero and watch the lights flicker on across the span, try to see past the postcard image. Think of Fred Dumatson's young wife, waiting for a husband who would never come home because a derrick collapsed. Think of the 10 men who felt the net give way, the terrifying realization that the one thing between them and eternity was a web of hemp that had been neglected. Think of Charles Ellis, the forgotten genius, whose name was scrubbed from the bridge for the crime of being right. The cost of the Golden Gate Bridge cannot be measured in $35 million of 1930s currency. It must be measured in the empty chairs at dinner tables in San Francisco and Sausalito. It must be measured in the silence of the whistleblowers who are told to keep quiet so the bonds can be sold and the ribbons can be cut. We live in an age of crumbling infrastructure and skyrocketing budgets, where we are told that these projects are for the common good. But the common good is a hollow phrase when it is built on the backs of men who are treated as disposable. The Golden Gate Bridge is not just a way to get from point A to point B, it is a laboratory of human endurance and human cruelty. It is a place where we proved we could conquer the elements, but also a place where we proved we could ignore the suffering of the individual for the glory of the state. The international orange paint isn't there to mimic the sunset. If you look closely enough, if you study the history of the rivets and the reality of the rust, you realize that the color is a warning. It is the color of the blood that the net couldn't hold. It is the color of the lives sacrificed to make a city feel grand. The total cost of this icon is staggering. 11 men officially died, but hundreds more were broken by the wind, the cold, and the lead paint that poisoned their lungs. Thousands of families in the path of the approach roads were displaced, their neighborhoods severed to make way for the car. The environmental impact of the massive concrete piers altered the currents of the bay forever. And today, we continue to pay the price in the form of a $400 million suicide barrier and a maintenance bill that will never, ever end. We are still paying for the ego of Joseph Strauss. We are still paying for the silencing of Charles Ellis. Next time you cross the Golden Gate Bridge, remember the vibrations beneath your tires aren't just the wind. They are the echoes of the men who stood on those cables when the world was shaking. They are the voices of the workers who knew the danger and went up anyway, not for glory, but for a paycheck to feed families that the history books chose to forget. Next time you use the Golden Gate Bridge, remember the workers who paid with their lives. If you want to know the cost of progress, hit subscribe. I'll show you what they built and who they buried.